I'm Alex Tarrant for interest.co.nz and welcome you to a double shot interview with Productivity Commission Chair Murray Sherwin, who's just put out a 516-page document with the Commission on how to better improve New Zealand's urban planning framework. Thanks for your time, Murray.
Pleasure. And every page is a gem.
Oh, I can imagine. It's huge. Now, the very sort of top line stuff as you're talking about, quite widespread change to New Zealand's urban planning framework, and I think what caught my eye first is basically scrap the RMA, replace it with more central government or central focused planning procedures. Take us through the high level of what you're proposing here.
Sure. Well, a little context first. What the government asked us to do was just step back. They've had the RMA around for 25 years. It's been back in front of the Parliament 18 times in that 25 years. It's more than doubled in length and has become more complicated, and there's lots of people feeling that it's lost its way, it's lost its shape.
Ambiguous
terminology. And a key finding for us is that for all of its sort of revolutionary concepts when it was first introduced, the RMA is not an urban planning document. It doesn't really deal with the urban environment, the built environment. A lot of it's around the natural environment, which was where it came from. What the government asked us to do was say, well, gee, are we getting to the end of the run with the RMA? Do we need to start again? Go away, take a clean sheet of paper and say, if you were starting again, what sorts of features, what sorts of principles and characteristics would you want to put into a new piece of legislation? So that's what we've been doing. It's really providing a platform for the government to say, are we up for this? Are we up for a change? And if so, what would we need to do? So that's the starting point.
Right. And so you've got 64 recommendations, I think. Interest.co readers are quite interested in certain things like land taxes, value taxes, land bankers. One of the recommendations that you put in is a change in how we levy rates, I think. So one on levying rates on the unimproved value of land. Can you just take us through the economics of this particular recommendation?
Well, there was a piece of work done for local government 20 odd years ago, I think, which looked at the rating base and recommended that councils move to improved value, capital value, so put the improvements in. And our sense is that actually that doesn't do what it was intended to do. And in particular, what it does is essentially lets people who are sitting on vacant land off the hook. They get a lower rating base because there's no improvements on their land. And those are the ones who may be land banking. And so it removes the incentive for them to get on with doing something with that land. And in broader economic terms anyway, you expect a tax on land, which is what rates are, to be the efficient way to tax, because you can't avoid it, you can't shift, so it's an efficient tax in its own right. The Auckland Council, for instance, was obliged under the Auckland City Act, the Super City Act, to move to capital value rating from its previous land base. So I don't think they're going to turn around quickly, but as a basic principle, we think land is a better basis for rating.
And that will affect land bankers mostly. How do you have any sense whether it could affect individual landowners?
You mean the ordinary householder?
Yeah, you and me.
Well, it should work out pretty much the same, actually. The work that we did suggested that it's about as equitable and maybe even more equitable than a capital value rating. The people who own the more expensive land in any event tend to be wealthier people, so it all works through.
So we encourage land bankers to maybe improve their land. We've got to get infrastructure out to that land. There's all this talk on at the moment about targeted rates and user pays for infrastructure. The Commission has made a few recommendations around this. Take us through those.
The proposition that we kept running up against when we talked to the rapidly growing cities was that growth doesn't pay for itself. There they are, rapidly growing populations. They need to roll out infrastructure, the three waters and roading and all the rest of it. Yet they're not getting the uplift in revenue through their rating base that's sufficient to cover that. And there's all sorts of reasons for that. And what we've done is explore different ways of trying to get a greater sort of responsiveness of city revenue to population growth.
Because rates are over long period of time.
Rates are over a long period of time,
and just bill immediately.
And the spread, the infrastructure comes up front, and so there's a risk factor in there for councils, which they're very conscious of. Also, they can spend a lot of money on infrastructure, and then if the property doesn't sell, if there's a downturn in the property market, they're left with vacant sections, but serviced with expensive infrastructure, and they're not getting any revenue at all, which is a risk factor for them to worry about, and quite a reasonable one for them to worry about. What we've tried to do is sort of identify ways in which you can get greater responsiveness of revenue to population growth in order to make, if you like, the investment in infrastructure more bankable. So things like user charges on water and sewers, which means people are paying for it, but also means that they're more likely to be efficient in their use of those resources. And we've seen in places that have introduced, for instance, water charging, that demand has fallen by as much as 30%. So that means you're not having to build more expensive infrastructure to cope with growth, because the existing stuff will go further.
Yeah, and the upkeep. Obviously, water pricing a big topic at the moment.
Absolutely, absolutely. And it's not the price of water, it's the price of infrastructure that we have to worry about.
Sure.
You can give the water away free if you like, but charge a delivery fee.
Sure.
But you can do the same on roading with user charges or congestion charges. But also for new developments, what we're proposing is that we look at targeted rates, which is a form of uplift tax, because if you've got a block of land which is unserviced and then the sewers and the roads come through, the value of that land jumps because of it's usable for dense development. So why shouldn't the council that's funding the infrastructure claim a slice of that to fund the cost of that infrastructure? And that's one of the proposals.
That's right, because you talk about value capture, don't you? And I mean, would I be correct in giving a sense that this would also include things like encouraging the councils to put value capture taxes on, say, property values that have increased due to the inner city rail link?
Absolutely. And there's some nice examples around. Melbourne's done this quite nicely. They've got a graduated tax on properties that run near one of their new inner city rail loops. Property values went up, the marketability and the rents in those properties go up, so the council gets a part of that to help fund the infrastructure.
Now, another recommendation you've looked at is acquisition powers, mandatory acquisition powers under the Public Works Act, and you talk about expanding this to urban development authorities. How do you think this would help?
Particularly when you're doing redevelopment in existing inner city areas, and you need to be able to build a sizable block of territory in order to do a scale redevelopment. You can have holdout problems where one landowner says, no, I'm just going to sit there and try and hang on to my block.
The Wellington Mayor would be saying this is happening at the moment.
Yeah. So I mean, we're quite cautious about this, because when you start messing around with private property rights, you need to be cautious, I think. But under the Public Works Act, we've got provisions in which the state can claim with proper pricing and compensation private property to enable public good activities to take place. And we're essentially looking to the same sort of model. I'm not sure that it'll be used a lot, and I think it's going to be used mostly if it is in inner city redevelopment areas.
Okay, right. And another recommendation I had a look at is you did look into Auckland Council funding constraints. Obviously, they're up against the buffers of their debt limits. We talked earlier about using targeted rates, perhaps as one way to get around that. You also talk about a central government guarantee, so using the central government's creditworthiness, which has been out there in the political sphere in the last couple of weeks. How did you come to those conclusions?
We spoke quite a lot with the Auckland Council about the constraints that they face, and one of them is the debt limits and credit rating agencies and so on. So that they see themselves as being quite hard up against their limits. So the question then is, how do you get some of the cost of investing in infrastructure either off the balance sheet or get a bit more scope in the balance sheet? Now, our sense is for rapidly growing cities, particularly if they can get a bit of responsiveness in terms of revenue flow to growth, then probably the debt limits that the credit rating agencies and others are setting are a bit tight. Okay. Rapidly growing cities, you'd expect to be carrying more debt and getting a return further down the track. But beyond that, it's really a question of looking to other balance sheets that you can put some of that debt on, or the risk of that debt on, to spread the load a bit in order to facilitate this. But clearly the capacity of cities to invest in infrastructure has been a major problem and remains a major problem.
Right now, there are a lot of recommendations. Some of them, I imagine, are going to be easy to implement, some of them hard.
Yeah.
How politically feasible do you think this is? Do we need the complete package, or are there certain things that you would like to see come out of this report immediately, the changes that can be made?
I don't think you need the complete package in terms of all 64 recommendations, but what we're saying is that it really is time to start again with the RMA and the other pieces of legislation that feed into urban
The
planning.
Local Government Act.
Local Government Act, the Land Transport Management Act in particular. There's a couple of others as well, but those are the key ones.
So the thing of merging these acts, or?
No, but just looking at how they work together. And the core for us is this new replacement for the RMA, if you like, which has specific provision for the built environment built into it, which has different set of requirements than the natural environment. So have both of those within the Act, but joined, because they need to be joined. There are environmental issues in the urban areas as well that need to be dealt with. And then a whole series of principles and objectives which are really clearly spelt out. And that sort of provides the framework within which councils build their planning, including starting with a big regional spatial plan, which is sort of the umbrella over top of this.
You're talking sort of 30
to 50 years out, and providing the skeleton within which development is expected to take place, securing at an early stage the corridors for roads and other infrastructure, so you're not trying to buy them late in the piece.
Sure.
And the councils work through their planning processes as they do now, with all the consultation and so on, but borrowing from the experience from Auckland and Christchurch with independent hearing panels, then having them review the plans as they do. And it's a non-political, technically specialist role, but they can check those plans against those principles and objectives spelled out in the Act. And one of the reasons for doing that is that we've seen quite a lot of regulatory overreach, if you like, out of the planners and the councils, where they start going beyond their mandates.
Just because they got pressure from the NIMBY saying,
all of that sort of stuff, and some stuff which really goes well beyond what you'd expect to be able to achieve under land use planning, which is effectively what this is. And just trying to sort of push back against some of that overreach, that regulatory overreach, and short circuit the review processes. We're also talking about more flexibility in the way that councils go about their consultation, because that's really important. They have to engage with their councils, with their communities, but the specificity in some of the existing acts and they don't sort of line up. The councils will find themselves consulting on particular propositions 2 or 3 times under different pieces of legislation. So trying to short circuit that and make it a more effective engagement with the community over future development, but then get on, make the decisions and make it work.
Good stuff. Well, the Finance Minister, I think, has said he's going to look into it, and he's got a bit of weekend reading to do, so
he sure has.
Let's see what happens. Right, well, Murray, thanks very much for joining us. That's Murray Sherwin. He's the chair of the Productivity Commission on their 516-page report on improving urban planning in New Zealand. I'm Alex Tarrant for interest.co.nz.